Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are beginning journal collection number 59, and this dates from the year 1868. Emerson will turn 65 years old. And as always, we begin with a editorial biographical update. As usual, Mr. Emerson lectured near and afar during the winter and in the spring, but just what the tour was does not clearly appear. During his absence, his brother William, who had lost his wife and was now very feeble, came from New York to consult a Boston physician and was a guest for some time at his brother's house. He returned to New York, where he died in September. Sometimes you must speak, if only as Aunt Mary told me when I was a boy and quarreled with Alicia Jones and Frank Barrett. Dr. Ripley sent for them one evening to come to the house, and there made us shake hands. Aunt Mary asked me, "Well, what did you say to them?" "I did not say anything." "Fie on you! You should have talked about your thumbs or your toes, only to say something." Admirable chapter of Harriet Martineau in her Eastern Life, Present and Past, Volume 1, page 230. One would think it had never been read, or that the minds of the readers had been instantly dripped in lathe. It needs instant republication and the advertisement to be cried in the churches. It plays into my chapter of quotation to find this necessity of repetition. If man takes any step, exerts any volition, initiates anything, no matter what, it is law of fate that another man shall repeat it, shall simply echo it. The Egyptian legend got this tyrannical currency, plowed itself into the Hebrew captives. Free trade. I have no knowledge of trade, and there is not the skyologist who cannot shut my mouth and my understanding by strings of facts that seem to prove the wisdom of tariffs. But my faith in freedom of trade, as the rule, returns always. If the Creator has made oranges, coffee, and pineapples in Cuba and refused them to Massachusetts, I cannot see why we should put a fine on the Cubans for bringing these to us, a fine so heavy as to enable Massachusetts men to build costly palm houses and glass conservatories, under which to coax these poor plants to ripen under our hard skies, and thus discourage the poor planter from sending them to gladden the very cottages here. We punish the planter there, and punish the consumer here for adding these benefits to life. Tax opium, tax poisons, tax brandy, gin, wine, hashish, tobacco, and whatever articles of pure luxury, but not healthy and delicious food. Beauty unequally bestowed. Yes, but the highest beauty is that of expression, and the same man is handsome or ugly as he gives utterance to good or base feeling. I noticed the other day that when a man whom I had always remarked as a handsome person was venting democratic politics, his whole expression changed and became mean and paltry. That is, nature distributed vulgar beauty unequally, as if she did not value it, but the most precious beauty she put in our own hands, that of expression. Norton read the other night in his lecture the decree of the Commune of Florence for the rebuilding of the cathedral, but wholly without effect, from the omission, perhaps the scorn, of emphasis. It should be read with the cry of a herald. Each supreme, says Harriet Martineau of the statues of the Egyptian gods. And why not? And men also, as the sky is perfect and the sea, porphyry and marble and iron and bronze, each is perfect and best in its place to the architect, and Roman cement under the sea, and wood and glass. A banker, Mr. Manger, told me that such is the promise of the investments of the undertakers of the Pacific Railroad, that vaster fortunes will be made in this country than were ever amassed by private men, that men now alive will perhaps come to town $1,000,000,000. 'Tis well that the Constitution of the United States has forbidden entails, and the only defense of the people against private power is from death the distributor. I have lately had repeated occasion to regret the omission to ask questions, while there was yet time, of persons who alone could answer them, and now that these are dead, there is none living who can give me the information. To have been so easily near the witnesses, and to have neglected an opportunity which now the whole world could not restore. I wish the American poet should let old times go and write on tariff, universal suffrage, women's suffrage. Science shall not be abused to make guns. The poet shall bring out the blazing truth, that he who kills his brother commits suicide. The gold was not hid in the black mountains, that one man should own it all. The telegraph shall be open as writing is to all men. The grape is fertile this year, that men may be genial and gentle, and make better laws, and not for their set alone. Thus shall the harvest of 1868 be memorable. The law shall sternly hold men to their best, and fools shall not be allowed to administer what requires all the wisdom of the wisest. I read with interest this line in the second book of Herodotus. The Egyptians are the first of mankind who have defended the immortality of the soul. Extremes meet, and there is no better example than the haughtiness of humility. No aristocrat, no Porphyrogenites can begin to compare with the self-respect of the saint. Aunt Mary, in her vision of her place in heaven, looks very coolly at her divine master. I approach no nearer the person of my divine master, but the infinite must forever and ever surround me. I had too proud a spirit, too elate, too complacent from constitution, may be ever to have the affinity to Jesus which his better, holier ones have. It is simply the consciousness, however yet obscure and undefined, of resting on deity that destroys all other divinities, or so-called divinities, and can well afford to be disgraced and degraded in their presence. Among the men who fulfill the part of the American gentleman, I place gladly Theodore Lyman, who went in a right spirit to the war, and who now works so faithfully and beneficently in this charge of establishing the pisciculture in Massachusetts. I understood Dr. C.T. Jackson in talks yesterday to say that the balloon can never be relied on as a machine for travel, since the attempt to resist the wind and sail against it will tear the balloon to pieces, that there must be wings invented to fly against the wind, and that gun cotton, which is so light, and especially which does not soil the barrel, is the best force yet found. The reliance on a permanent west wind in the upper region of the atmosphere may hold only over the land and not over the sea. In the region of the trade winds, the balloon may be applicable. The project has ceased to be presumptuous since the ocean telegraph has become a fact. What a divine beneficence attaches to Andrew Johnson! In 6 troubles, and in 7 he has been an angel to the Republican party, delivering them out of their distress. The eye altering alters all. The saint, with grand healthy perception, in the atheism of Byron, reads the ciphers of eternity, finds in heathen fables and mythology the veiled truths of theism. A great cosmical intellect is indifferent to the arts, may easily look at them as poor toys, as he would look at a children's picture alphabet. The saint only cares that the naturalist detects design in nature. Himself is quite careless of the vaunted evidences. He has vision. Obstructives of the present day are the Pope, with his encyclical letter, and his later demonstrations, Bishop of Orleans, Dupanloup, Bishop of Oxford, the State of New Jersey, Andrew Johnson. March 1868. I hold it a proof of our high capabilities that Horatio Greenough was born in Boston. Can anyone doubt that if the noblest saint among the Buddhists, the noblest Mohammedan, the highest Stoic of Athens, the purest and wisest Christian, Menu in India, Confucius in China, Spinoza in Holland, could somewhere meet and converse together, they would all find themselves of one religion, and would all find themselves denounced by their own sects and sustained by these believed adversaries of their sects? Jeremy Taylor, George Herbert, Pascal even, Pythagoras. If these could all converse intimately, 2 and 2, how childish their country traditions would appear. March 18th. I suppose that what Richard Owen told me in London of Turner's coming to him to ask him to give him the natural history of the mollusk on which the whale fed, he wishing to understand it ab ovo thoroughly, because he was going to paint the whale ship, was just that chance of suggestion which I sought for my Song of Boston, and going down the harbor to Nantasket, and in my visit not yet made to Bunker Hill Monument. We cannot give ourselves too many advantages, and a hint to the center of the subject may spring from these pensive strolls around the walls. Education. The Sunday school man who said his class were already in the Swiss Robinson, and he hoped by next term to get them into Robinson Crusoe. I have a problem for an engineer, this. To what height must I build a tower in my garden that shall show me the Atlantic Ocean from its top? Where is the Coast Survey? You, said the Brahmin Mandanus to the king Alexander the Great, are the only man whom I have ever found curious in the investigation of philosophy at the head of an army. Strabo. Man of science. Common sense or law of bodies must be obeyed. But he finds limits to this, or itself leading to contradictions, for matter is fluent and has no solid bottom, mere bubbles at last. Then the very mathematician and materialist is forced to a poetic result, as metamorphosis, progressive or arrested development. Unity. In vain he would keep up the bars of species or genera. The pedant becomes poet against his will. Cuvier must approximate to Geoffrey St. Hilaire in spite of himself. These dreadful Okens and Goethes will be born. Unity, unity. There is the mischievous mind as tyrannical, nay, more tyrannic than the other. The Niagara currents in the mind. The mind must think by means of matter, find matter or nature the means and words of its thinking and expression. The world at school and university for heaven or thought. Editor's note. Here follows in the journal a list of the committee appointed to visit the Greek department at Harvard College the following year, in which Mr. Emerson's name appears. End note. Revolutions. In my youth, Spinoza was a hobgoblin, now he is a saint. When I see tracts of blowing sand planted with pitch pine trees, and held fast as granite slabs has been laid on them, and by the annual fall of the leaves made slowly but surely into a fertile soil, when I see the Japanese building a steam navy, and their men of rank sending children to America for their education, the Chinese, instead of stoning an ambassador if he steps out of the walls of Canton, now choosing Mr. Burlingame as their ambassador to Western courts, when I see a good spring of water found by a hazel twig, and my message sent from Boston to London in 60 seconds. The plow displaces the spade, the bridge displaces the ferryman, the press displaces the scrivener, the locomotive, the coach, the telegraph, the courier. Greatness. The appearance of a great man draws a new circle outside of our largest orbit, and surprises and commands us. It is as if to the girl fully occupied with her paper dolls a youth approaches and says, "I love you with all my heart, come to me." Instantly she leaves all, dolls, dances, maids, and youths, and dedicates herself to him. Or, as California in 1849 or the war in 1861 electrified the young men and abolished all their little plans and projects with a magnificent hope or terror, requiring a whole new system of hopes and fears and means. Our little circles absorb and occupy us as fully as the heavens. We can minimize as infinitely as maximize, and the only way out of it is to use a country phrase, to kick the pail over and accept the horizon instead of the pail, with celestial attractions and influences instead of worms and mud pies. Coleridge, Goethe, the new naturalists in astronomy, geology, zoology, the correlations, the social science, the new readings of history through Niebuhr, Mommsen, Max Müller, Champollion, Lepsius, astonish the mind and detach it effectually from a hopeless routine. Come out of that, they say. You lie sick and doting. only shifting from bed to bed. And they dip the patient in this Russian bath, and he is at least well awake and capable of sane activity. The perceptions which metaphysical and natural science cast upon the religious traditions are every day forcing people in conversation to take new and advanced position. We have been building on the ice, and lo, the ice has floated, and the man is reconciled to his losses when he sees the grandeur of his gains. Henry Clapp said that Reverend Dr. O was always looking about to see if there was not a vacancy in the Trinity. He said that Greeley knew that he was a self-made man and was always glorifying his Maker. He said that T aimed at nothing and always hit it exactly. Goethe. Schiller wrote to Humboldt in 1802, "If Goethe had only a spark of faith, many things here might be improved." It takes 20 years to get a good book read, for each reader is struck with a new passage, and at first only with the shining and superficial ones, and by this very attention to these the rest are slighted. But with time the graver and deeper thoughts are observed and pondered. New readers come from time to time, their attention whetted by frequent and varied allusions to the book, until at last every passage has found its reader and commentator. May 22nd. Education. I am delighted today in reading Schwegler's account of Socrates, to have intelligent justice done to Aristophanes. The rogue gets his dues. Go into the school or the college and see the difference of faculty. Some who lap knowledge as a cat laps milk, and others very slow blockheads. Cowley considered the use of a university for the cherishing of gifted persons. Editor's note: here follow most of pages 32 and 33 in Poetry and Imagination, Letters and Social Aims. End note. Tennyson's Saint Grail. Tennyson has abundant invention, but contents himself with the just enough, is never obscure or harsh in a new or rare word. Then he has marked virility, as if a surgeon or practical physiologist had no secrets to teach him, but he deals with these as Abraham or Moses would, and without prudery or pruriency. His inventions are adequate to the dignity of the fable. The gift of the adequate expression is his. Then a note says, Bacchic frenzy in Maud, a nightingale drunken with his overflowing melody, an animal heat in the verse, and its opulent continuations. End note. The priest is astonished to find a holiness in this knight-errant which he himself never knew, and rubs his eyes. The fine invention of Tennyson is in crowding into an hour the slow creation and destruction of centuries. It suggests, besides, in the coming and vanishing of cities and temples, what really befalls in long durations on earth, how science of ethnology limps after these attachments, miracles of cities and temples made by Merlin like thoughts. What I wrote on the last leaf concerning Tennyson is due perhaps to the first reading, to the new wine of his imagination, and I may not enjoy it or rate it so highly again. Editor's note. Then Mr. Emerson writes into the journal 3 years later, under date of October 1871, the following sentence: the only limit to the praise of Tennyson as a lyric poet is that he is alive. If he were an ancient, there would be none. May. Dionysius the elder, when someone asked him if he was at leisure, replied, "May that never befall me." Calvinism is the breath of a hot village of Teutonic peasants, exalted to the highest power, their notions of right and wrong, their loves and fears and hatreds, their notions of law and punishment and reward, all acute but narrow, ignorant and revengeful, yet devout. Dr. Watts's hymns are its exponent. I remember that Burnap in the Cambridge Divinity School used to say that Calvinism stood on 3 legs: Dr. Watts's Psalms and hymns, Milton's Paradise Lost, and the Westminster Catechism, or was there not a 4th, King James translation of the Bible? I should say that the opposite pole of theology was the Hindu Buddhism, as represented in the prayers of the Bhagavata Purana. We had a story one day of a meeting of the Atlantic Club, when the copies of the new number of the Atlantic being brought in, everyone rose eagerly to get a copy, and then each sat down and read his own article. Out of power, a party is immensely strong. It stands for principles, and its opponents have nothing but possession. But the moment the radical or republican comes into place, he has then to consider not what should be, but also what can be, which he finds a very different and very difficult problem. Did you give Athens the best laws? No, replied Solon, but the best it would receive. Old and New. We read the English and foreign news with relish, the American with disrelish. We read of Socrates, Antoninus, and Menu gladly, not so gladly of our hodiernal churches. When I remember how easily and happily I think in certain company, as for instance in former years with Alcott and Charles Newcomb, earlier with Peter Hunt, though I must look far and wide for the persons and conditions, which yet were real, and how unfavorable my daily habits and solitude are for this success, and consider also how essential this commerce is to fruitfulness in writing, I see that I cannot exaggerate its importance among the resources of inspiration. Gurney seemed to me, in an hour I once spent with him, a fit companion. Holmes has some rare qualities. Horatio Greenough shone, but one only listened to him. So Carlyle. Henry Hedge, George Ward especially, and if one could ever get over the fences and actually on even terms, Eliot Cabot. But I should like to try George E. Tufts, my brilliant correspondent of 3 letters, and William B. Wright of the Highland Rambles. There is an advantage of being somewhat in the chair of the company, a little older and better read, if one is aiming at searching thought. And yet how heartily I could sit silently, purely listening and receptive beside a rich mind. May 30th. Heard Weiss speak on the platform of the Free Religious Society, and was struck with his manhood. Use and opportunity with such rare talent would have made him a great orator. He makes admirable points, but has the fault of lingering around a point, and repeats it and dulls it. But sincerity and independence and courage, in short, manhood, he has, which the audience heartily enjoys, and tamer speakers learn a good lesson. He at least vindicates himself as a man, and one of great and subtle resources. How important an educator has Scott been! In the Board of Overseers of the college, the Committee on Honorary Degrees reported unfavorably on all but the commanding names, and instantly the president and an ex-president pressed the action of the corporation, acknowledging that these men proposed for honors were not very able or distinguished persons, but it was the custom to give these degrees without insisting on eminent merit. I remember that Dr. Follen, in his disgust at the reverend and honorable doctors he saw in America, wished to drop the title and be called Mr. Who listens to eloquence makes discoveries. A man who thought he was in earnest hears, and finds out that he was not. How we then feel that we could wash the feet of the speaker for the right. C.J. Fox said if he had a boy he would make him write verses, the only way of knowing the meaning of words. Recollections of Samuel Rogers. What Landor said of Canning is truer of Disraeli, that he is an understrapper made an overstrapper. June 16th. In reading these fine poems of Morris, I see but one defect, but that is fatal, namely, that the credence of the reader no longer exists. I wrote thus last night after reading King Acrisius, but this evening I have read The Proud King, wherein the fable is excellent and the story fits this and all times. Beauty is in great part a moral effect. It comes to serenity, to cheerfulness, to benignity, to innocence, to settled noble purpose. It flees from the perplexed, the self-seeking, the cowardly, the mean, the despairing, the frivolous, and the stupid. Self-respect, how indispensable to it, a free and contented air. The roots of today are in yesterday and the days and days before. Why is this girl always unaccountably cheerful? Only because the due letter was written and posted yesterday, the valise of her brother's clothes went by the express, and he must have received them hours ago, and there is time this forenoon for all that is to be done. So with the weeks and the months. 'Tis her habit, and every day brings the gay acknowledgment of these petty fidelities, by letter or by faces of all whom she meets. The youth gets on obscurely well enough from day to day, but once he chances to meet a young man who tells him something. He rolls it over in his mind for a day or two and must go back to him. The friend has told him his fortune. He has given him his character. He now sees somewhat he never saw, though the same things were close beside him. Every talk with that youth interests him, and all his life has a new look whilst with him. He does not care longer for the old companions. They are tame and superficial. He wants a witch. He wants an interpreter, a poet, a sympathizer. He has heard of books, and finds one at last that reminds him of his friend. This also is a dear companion. Dreary are the names and numbers of volumes of Hegel and the Hegelians, to me, who only want to know at the shortest the few steps, the two steps, or the one taken. I know what step Berkeley took, and recognize the same in the Hindu books. Hegel took a second and said that there are two elements, something and nothing, and that the two are indispensable at every subsequent step, as well as at the first. Well, we have familiarized that dogma, and at least found a kind of necessity in it, even if poor human nature still feels the paradox. Now, is there any third step which Germany has made of like importance and renown? It needs no encyclopedia of volumes to tell. I want not the metaphysics, but only the literature of them. Enchantments. There are inner chambers of poetry, which only poets enter. Thus, loosely we might say, Shakespeare's sonnets are readable only by poets, and it is a test of poetic apprehension, the value which a reader attaches to them, but also the poem. Let the bird of loudest lay on the soul of Arabian tree, etc., etc. And the three notes that follows it, if published for the first time today anonymously, would be hooted in all journals. And yet such a poem comes but once in a century, and only from a genius. I prize Beaumont and Fletcher's song, Fountain heads and pathless groves, etc., in the same way. We think we have a key to the affair if we can find that Italian artists were at Agra 4 centuries ago, and so the Taj is accounted for. Or if Greeks were in Egypt earlier than we had found, and ties of one race can be detected, the architectural race that built in both lands. But the wonder is the one man that built one temple, and after that, the creation of two temples, or two styles, or 20, is easy to accept. Yea and nay. We go to the artist's studio and see his plans. They do not satisfy this exigent eye, which yet knows not what it wants, only knows that these drawings do not content it. But any number of nays does not help us in the smallest degree. Nothing will but the blessed appearance from any quarter of a plan of genius that meets all the conditions and delights us, and we all say, "That is it." The Cabots built the Athenaeum. Billings went into it and said, "This hall and this staircase wants greatness," and drew his plans. The committee and the Cabots assented at once, and Billings was added to the Cabots as one of the architects. Newport, July. Seashore. Here chimes no clock, no pedant calendar. My waves abolish time, dwarf days to hours, and give my guest eternal afternoon. July 13th. I have seen Sarah Clark and her friends at Newport with great pleasure and content, at least with as much as so bad a traveler and visitor as I can find. The land and water have the unfailing charm of the sea, which abolishes time, makes it all afternoon or vacation, and always tells us how far we are from nature, and that the first poetry is not yet written. As I was told in Venice that there were plenty of people who never stirred out of it into the mainland, and as my Mrs. Holbrook, with whom I went from Boston to Malta, never went on deck or saw the sea, so it is in seaports. The wharves are practically as far from the ocean as are the mountains. A boy born in Boston may often wander with boys down to the wharves, see the ships, boats, and sailors, but his attention is occupied by the rough men and boys, very likely by the fruit ships and their cargoes, especially the molasses casks. His eye may never get beyond the islands and the lighthouse to the sea. He remains a cockney, and years later chances to visit far from his town the shore where the ocean is not hidden by ships and the wharf population, but fills the horizon. Its chill breath comes to him a snuff of defiance. He realizes its wonder for the first time, and now first beholds the maker of cities and of civilization, and may come to understand how Greece came to exist, and Tyre in England. Newport. The admirable sites for buildings and the combination of so many advantages point plainly to its future as the attractive waterside in the country. My chief acquisition was the acquaintance of Mrs. Helen Hunt, Sarah Clark's friend, and her poetry I could heartily praise. The sonnet Thought and Ariadne's Farewell were the best, but all had the merit of originality, elegance, and compression. Mrs. Hunt wished me to admire George Eliot's Spanish Gypsy, but on superficial trial by hearing passages I refused. It was manufactured, not natural poetry. Any elegant and cultivated mind can write as well, but she has not insight into nature, nor a poetic ear. Such poetry satisfies readers and scholars too at first sight, does not offend, conciliates respect, and it is not easy to show the fault. But let it lie a while, and nobody will return to it. Indeed, time, as I often feel, is an indispensable element of criticism. You cannot judge of Nahant or Newport or of a gallery or a poem until you have outlived the dismay or overpowering of a new impression. I took a volume of Wordsworth in my valise and read for the first time, I believe, carefully, The White Doe of Rylstone, a poem in a singularly simple and temperate key, without ornament or sparkle, but tender, wise, and religious, such as only a true poet could write, honoring the poet and the reader. August 16th. Came home last night from Vermont with Ellen. Stopped at Middlebury on the 11th, Tuesday, and read my discourse on Greatness and the Good Work and Influence of Heroic Scholars. On Wednesday, spent the day at Essex Junction and traversed the banks and much of the bed of the Winooski River, much admiring the falls and the noble mountain peaks of Mansfield and Camel's Hump, which there appears to be the highest, and the views of the Adirondacks across the lake. In the evening, took the stage to Underhill Center, and the next morning, in unpromising weather, strolled away with Ellen towards the Mansfield Mountain 4 miles off, and the clouds gradually rising and passing from the summit, we decided to proceed towards the top, which we reached, with many rests at the halfway house, and at broad stones on the path, a little before 2 o'clock, and found George Bradford at the mountain house. We were cold and a little wet, but found the house warm with stoves. After dinner, Ellen was thoroughly warmed and recruited lying on a settee by the stove, and meanwhile I went up with Mr. Bradford and a party to the top of the Chin, which is the highest land in the state, 4,400 feet. I have later heard it stated 4,389 feet. Lake Champlain lay below us, but was a perpetual illusion, as it would appear a piece of yellow sky, until careful examination of the islands in it and the Adirondack summits beyond brought it to the earth for a moment. But if we looked away an instant and then returned, it was the sky again. When we reached the summit, we looked down upon the Lake of the Clouds, and the party which reached the height a few minutes before us had a tame cloud which floated by a little below them. This summer, bears and a panther have been seen on the mountain, and we peeped into some rocky caves which might house them. We came on the way to the edge of a crag, which we approached carefully, and lying on our bellies, and it was easy to see how dangerous a walk this might be at night, or in a snowstorm. The White Mountains it was too misty to see, but Owl's Head near Lake Memphremagog was pointed out. Perhaps it was a half-mile only from the house to the top of the Chin, but it was a rough and grand walk. On such occasions I always returned to my fancy that the best use of wealth would be to carry a good professor of geology and another of botany with you. In the house were perhaps 20 visitors besides ourselves. A Mr. Taylor of Cincinnati, a very intelligent gentleman, with excellent political views, Republican and free trader. George Bartlett was there with a gay company of his friends, who had come up from Stowe, where he had given a theatrical entertainment of amateurs the night before. In the evening they amused us mightily with charades of violent fun. The next morning a man went through the house ringing a large bell and shouting, "Sunrise!" and everybody dressed in haste and went down to the piazza. Mount Washington and the Franconia Mountains were clearly visible, and Ellen and I climbed now to the nose, which the ascent is made easy by means of a stout rope firmly attached near the top and reaching down to the bottom of the hill near the house. 20 people are using it at once at different heights. After many sharp looks at the heavens and the earth, we descended to breakfast. I found in this company many agreeable people. At 9:30 a.m., Ellen and I, accompanied for some distance by George Bradford, set forth on our descent in the loveliest of mornings, and parting from him at one of the galleries, arrived safely at the halfway house, there to find a troop of our fellow boarders of the Underhill house just mounting their horses to climb the mountain. They advised us to take a little forest path to the mossy glen before we continued our journey from this point, which we did, and found a pretty fall. Returning to the halfway house, which is empty and only affords at this time a restinging place for travelers and a barn for horses, we resumed our walk and arrived, without other event than a little delay among the raspberries, at Mr. Prouty's hotel at Underhill, say at 1:30, dined, repacked our trunk, and took a wagon to Stowe, thence the stagecoach to Essex Junction, and thence the train which brought us to Burlington, where we spent the night, and the next morning the Rutland and Burlington train, which brought us safely to Westminster, Massachusetts, where Ellen took a wagon for Princeton, and I continued my railroad ride to Concord, arriving at 6:30 in the evening. Editor's Note: On August 21st, the city of Boston gave a banquet in honor of the Chinese embassy and the recently ratified treaty with China, negotiated by our minister to that country, also its ambassador to ours, Mr. Burlingame. Mr. Emerson made a short address on the occasion, which is printed in the Miscellanies. End note. University. The university question divides people with some rancor, which blinds the eyes, and I hope will be avoided in consideration of the gravity of the subject. We might as well come to it after a late dinner in the strength of wine as to hope to treat it wisely on the strength of party and passion. The general uneasiness and movement in the public in regard to education shows a certain cleavage. Evils of the college. It does not justify itself to the pupil. It does not open its doors to him, balks him with petty delays and refusals. The instructors are in false relations to the student. Instead of an avenue, it is a barrier. Let him find good advice, but of a wise man, sympathetic, a patron of the youth on entering the gate. It gives degrees on time, on the number of dinners eaten. Eat your terms, not on examination. It gives foolish diplomas of honor to every old clergyman or successful gentleman who lives within 10 miles. Ball and boat clubs do not hurt, but help the moral of the students. If the college falls behind the culture of the people, it is instantly ridiculous. For my report on the Greek committee, I must not forget to insert my opinion on examinations, that whenever one is on trial, two are on trial. The examiner is instructed whenever the pupil is examined. At Monadnock, the final cause of towns appears to be seen from the mountains. Nature. Day by day for her darlings, to her much she added more. In her 100-gated Thebes, every chamber was a door. a door to something grander, loftier walls, and vaster floor. J.T. Williams said that he told a friend of Evarts that he considered Evarts the best candidate for the United States Senate from New York and should labor for his election. Afterwards he met Evarts, who came up to him and thanked him for the kind expression he had used. After Evarts had entered the president's cabinet, Williams saw him again and told him that his new action had lost him the opportunity forever. He would never be United States Senator from New York. Evarts said, no, he was quite mistaken, and that he was now secure of being the man, whichever party prevailed. For, said he, unquestionably the Democratic Party will carry the election in New York. Advances with rapturous lyrical glances, singing the song of the earth, singing hymns to the gods. Is it Goethe's? France is a country of method and numerical order, the palace of arithmetic. Everything is centralized, and by a necessity of their nature, the French have introduced the decimal system of weights and measures and made it perfect. They measured the first degree of the meridian, Picards. They published the first national dictionary of the language. In the Revolution, they abolished the chronology of the world and began with the year 1. Then there's a quotation in French. The only place where I feel the joy of eminent domain is in my woodlot. My spirits rise whenever I enter it. I can spend the entire day there with a hatchet or pruning shears making paths without a remorse of wasting time. I fancy the birds know me, and even the trees make little speeches or hint them. Then Allah does not count the time which the Arab spends in the chase. Ah, what a blessing to live in a house which has on the ground floor one room or one cabinet, in which a Worcester's unabridged, a Liddell and Scott, an Andrews and Stoddard, Lempierre's Classical, a Gradus ad Parnassum, a Haydn's Dictionary of Dates, a Biographie Générale, a Speer's French and Flugel's German Dictionary, even if Grimm is not yet complete, where these and their equivalents, if equivalents can be, are always at hand. And yet I might add, as I often do, ah, happier if these are their substitutes, have been in that house for 2 generations or for 3. For Horace's meters and Greek literature will not be thoroughly domesticated in one life. A house, I mean, where the seniors who are at fault about school questions can inquire of the juniors with some security of a right answer. This is one of my dreams for the American house. Editor's note. During October and November, Mr. Emerson gave a course of 6 lectures in Boston. The subjects were Art, Poetry and Criticism, Historic Notes of Life and Letters in New England, Leasts and Mosts, Hospitality, Homes, Greatness. End note. The distinction of the poet is ever this force of imagination which puts the objects before him with such deceptive power that he treats them as real. Single speech. Laodamia is almost entitled to that eminence in Wordsworth's literary performance. That and the Ode on Immortality are the best. 'Tis really by a sentence or a phrase or two that many great men are remembered. Zoroaster has 3 or 4, and Marcus Aurelius only as many. George Tufts wrote me, "Life is a flame whose splendor hides its base." Mediocre books. There are the sound stomachs and the sick. The farmer and the butcher minister to the sound, the physician and the confectioner to the sick. The well can look at the sun and use all his light and heat, the sick only what is reflected and shaded. It is the same in literature. Strong minds ask principles, direct apricus, and original forms. The sick public want what is secondary, conventional, and imitations of imitations. There is need of Shakespeare and Hegel, and also of Martin Tupper, if that is his name, and McCosh. In the perplexity in which the literary public now stands with regard to university education, whether study shall be compulsory or elective, whether by lecturers or professors, or whether by private tutors, Whether the stress shall be on Latin and Greek or on modern sciences, the one safe investment which all can agree to increase is the library. A good book can wait for a reader hundreds of years. Once lodged in the library, it is inexpensive and harmless while it waits. Then it is a good of the most generous kind, not only serving the undergraduates of the college, but much more the alumni, and probably much more still the scattered community of scholars. Ours is the state of fermentation of science. The heavens open, and the earth and every element and disclose their secrets. The large utterance of the gods, which in every organism nature retains, the great style, the fate or invariable adherence to its qualities and methods, and the unity of system which reigns through all the innumerable and immense parts, we are daily learning, and what beams of light have shone upon men now first in this century. The genius, nature, is ever putting conundrums to us, and the savants, as in the girls' game of 20 questions, are every month solving them successfully by skillful, exhaustive method. This success makes the student cheerful and confident, and his new illumination makes it impossible for him to acquiesce in the old barbarous routine, whether of politics or religion or commerce or social arrangements. Nature will not longer be kinged or churched or colleged or drawing-roomed as before. A man never gets acquainted with himself, but is always a surprise. We get news daily of the world within, as well as the world outside, and not less of the central than of the surface facts. A new thought is awaiting him every morning. I often think how hard it is to say with sweetness your thoughts, when you know that it affronts and exasperates your audience. It is even difficult to write it for such readers without leaving on the line some bitterness. But the French do this, and the French alone, with perfect equanimity in their excellent Revue des Deux Mondes. John Hunter was so far from resting his mind in society that he felt real fatigue in the midst of company where the conversation n'avait pas de suite. Biographie Générale. His museum cost him £70,000. The government bought it for £15,000 after long negotiation. Pitt said, "'Tis not a time to buy anatomical pieces when I want money to buy powder." Don't ask me, he said to his pupils, what I thought a year ago, on this or that. Ask me what I think today. He, Hunter, first used the expression arrested development, which plays so important a part in modern science. November 11th. Yesterday was well occupied in accompanying William Robert Ware to the church he is building for the First Church Society on Berkeley Street. It has a completeness and uniformity of strength, richness, and taste, perfect adaptation to its present purpose, and an antiquity in all its ornamentation that give delight. It seemed to threaten ruin to the Radical Club, retroaction, and all people who shall sit down in its sumptuous twilight. I lamented for my old friend Dr. Frothingham, his loss of sight once more, that he could not enjoy this faultless temple. I looked through all the details of the drawings for the alumni hall at Ware's office, which conciliate the eye very fast, and the capital suggestion that the dining hall shall be used for daily commons, if properly accepted and followed up, will go far to remove every point of objection on the old ground that this vast expense is for 3 or 4 days only in the year. In his technologic chambers he showed me a multitude of interesting fragments of art, cast mainly from Trajan's column, from English, French, and Italian churches, a head from a statue at Rheims Cathedral of the 13th or 16th century by John of Bologna, which gives what I always seek when I see new sculpture, decisive proof of a master. Ware believes the Romans were their own artists and not Greeks, confirmed by specimens of Etruscan art which he saw. December 9th. In poetry, tone. I have been reading some of Lowell's new poems, in which he shows unexpected advance on himself, but perhaps most in technical skill and courage. It is in talent rather than in poetic tone, and rather expresses his wish, his ambition than the uncontrollable interior impulse, which is the authentic mark of a new poem, and which is unanalyzable, and makes the merit of an ode of Collins, or Gray, or Wordsworth, or Herbert, or Byron, and which is felt in the pervading tone rather than in brilliant parts or lines, as if the sound of a bell or a certain cadence expressed in a low whistle, or booming, or humming to which the poet first timed his step, as he looked at the sunset, or thought, was the incipient form of the piece, and was regnant through the whole. Wordsworth is manly, the manliest poet of his age. His poems record the thoughts and emotions which have occupied his mind, and which he reports because of their reality. He has great skill in rendering them into simple and sometimes happiest poetic speech. Tennyson has incomparable felicity in all poetic forms, and is a brave, thoughtful Englishman, exceeds Wordsworth 100-fold in rhythmic power and variety, but far less manly compass. And Tennyson's main purpose is the rendering, whilst Wordsworth's is the just value of the dignity of the thought. I told Ware that I prize Michelangelo so much that, whilst I look at his figures, I come to believe the grandiose is grand. Thomas Gray in poetry has relations to Michelangelo, and the like question between the grandiose and grand is suggested in reading his odes. An Englishman has firm manners. He rests secure on the reputation of his country, on his family, his education, and his expectations at home. There is in his manner a suspicion of insolence. If his belief in the 39 Articles does not bind him much, his belief in the 40th does, namely, that he shall not find his superiors elsewhere. Hence, a complaint you shall often find made against him here, that, whilst at his house, he would resent as unpermissible that a guest should come to a 7 o'clock dinner in undress, he bursts into yours in shooting jacket. Well, it is for the company to put him in the wrong by their perfect politeness. When I find in people narrow religion, I find narrow reading. Remarkable New England families were the three Jackson brothers, Dr. James, Judge Charles, and Patrick; the three Lowell brothers, John, Reverend Dr. Charles, and Francis Cabot Lowell; the four Lawrences, Abbott, Amos, Luther, William; the Cabots; the three Hunts, William, Richard, and Levitt. William Hunt tells me also of his brother John in Paris; the Washburns, three governors, I believe. Culture is one thing, and varnish another. There can be no high culture without pure morals. With the truly cultivated man, the maiden, the orphan, the poor man, and the hunted slave feel safe. There are so many men in the world that I can be spared to work a great while on one chapter, so long that when at last it is finished and printed and returns to me, I can read it without pain and know that others can. Farming. Marshall Miles said to me that he wants to come home to his old farm, and thinks he shall presently. Quote, "For it is what you get out of the earth that is pure gain, but what we get by speculating, each on the other, is not." A chapter on the intellect should begin low by examples, as Thales on his shadow of the pyramid, or Huy on his finding the laws of cleavage in crystals, and so instructing the lapidary how to cut, and plenty of other illustrations how the laws of real nature are turned into rules of thumb. And if I understand them, that the laws of the catenary, of Hooke's, and the corollaries of Chladni's central discovery of music on the steel filings, for which we see Tyndall on sound, and if I could understand it again, the related suggestion of the form of the skeleton of mammals by Dr. Wyman from the iron filings on a paper over the magnet. Mrs. Sarah Alden Ripley said that the farmers like to be complimented with thought. This is the end of Journal Collection number 59, dating from the year 1868, when the author was 65 years old. Thank you for listening.